Hello, everyone. How are you today? Does anybody mind if I take my mask off for just this part? Okay, thank you. I'm Jed Morse, Chief Curator here at the Nasher Sculpture Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this conversation, which is really a celebration of the exhibition Carol Bove, Collage Sculptures, which, if you haven't seen, you'll have a chance to see it. It runs through January 9th. As well as the recent arrival of a really beautiful catalog, which you might have caught outside, of the same title published on the occasion of the exhibition. The exhibition and the catalog survey the most recent 5 years of the artist's work. These welded and bolted steel assemblages engage conceptual concerns of mid-century abstract sculpture, such as spontaneity, industrial materials, and the potential of painted sculpture. Within these familiar sculptural traditions, Bove discovers new, richly inventive approaches. Bove's collage sculptures can possess an appearance of almost impossible softness and can range from small pedestal sculptures to large, imposing compositions. In addition, Bove's selection of small works by other artists in the collection of the Nasher Sculpture Center explores her interest in scale and how a viewer's understanding of an artwork shifts depending on its context. Born in 1971 in Geneva, Switzerland, Bove was raised in Berkeley, California, and studied at New York University. Her work has been featured in significant solo exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Common Guild in Glasgow, Palais de Tokyo in Paris, Tate St. Ives, Blanton Museum of Art at the University of Texas at Austin, the Kunsthalle Zurich, the Institute of Contemporary Art Boston, and the Kunstverein in Hamburg. Her work has also been meaningfully paired with that of significant historical figures, such as with John Chamberlain at SF MoMA in 2019 and Carlos Scarpa at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds in 2014. Bove's work has also been included in major international surveys, such as the 2019, 2017, and 2011 editions of the Venice Biennale, Documenta 13 in Kassel, Germany in 2012, and the 2008 Whitney Biennial. Numerous museums count Bove's work among their collections, including the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, the Fonds Régional d'Art Contemporain, or FRAC, in Nord-Pas-de-Calais in Dunkirk, France, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Princeton University Art Museum, SF MoMA, Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, and the Yale University Art Gallery in New Haven, Connecticut. Bove was the second artist commissioned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York to create site-specific work for the niches on the museum's facade. The installation of 4 large-scale sculptures titled "The Seances Aren't Helping" took place earlier this year. She currently lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. In conversation with Carol today is the curator of the exhibition at the Nasher and author and editor of the catalog, Nasher Sculpture Center curator Dr. Catherine Kraft. Dr. Kraft holds a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and held positions at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York before joining the Nasher in 2011. Since joining the Nasher, she has curated numerous exhibitions, including Melvin Edwards' 5 Decades in 2015, The Nature of Art in 2018-2019, and the recent exhibition of work from the Nasher collection, Nasher Mixtape. She has spoken and published on a wide variety of subjects, including Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, as well as Dada, Neo-Dada, and the emergence of abstract expressionism, which are topics of particular expertise. So it is my pleasure to ask you to join me in welcoming Catherine Kraft and Carol Bove.
Hello.
Thanks, Jen.
Carol, it's very nice to have you back. When we were preparing for this conversation, Carol said reassuringly that we don't have to do a lot of preparation because we're both experts. So you're in good hands. So I think one of the sort of unusual things about this whole process was that the actual time frame of the body of work, this exhibition and catalog surveys, actually parallels our acquaintance and the planning of this exhibition, which we didn't realize at the time. But I want to just maybe use the time today to talk a little bit about how this body of work came about and what you continue to find in it. As we've seen, or as Jed mentioned, there are a group of works upstairs in the Nasher's galleries and in the garden. And these are works that began to be made starting in 2015. And prior to that, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this. Carol's work first came to public attention in works that featured modernist shelves or tables with aggregations of a variety of objects, books, peacock feathers, pieces of petrified wood that often spoke to or delved into the sort of decade or cultural period just before she was born, the 1960s. And at a point when I became more acquainted with her work, she had shifted into starting to work in larger scales and different materials. I'm showing two works from just about the period I started becoming more acquainted with her work, particularly these large white sculptures that are called glyphs. And I wonder, Carol, if you might say a little bit about the glyphs and how they kind of preceded or ended up coinciding in some cases with the works that were showing upstairs.
Yeah, I just had this idea. You're an expert on Dada and Surrealism and Abstract Expressionism, right?
Mm-hmm.
I ask you
Okay.
to, for the audience, describe or historically situate the ready-made.
Wow.
Because a lot of times I want to talk about my work and I'm just like, okay, there's this artist, Marcel Duchamp. Okay, so just stay with me. But I don't have to do that because you're a doctor.
See, that's right. See, and I knew this word expert would come back around because I've never liked this word. I'm distrustful
But you are a doctor.
of it.
I was like, when I heard your intro, I was just like, oh, I should call her Dr. Kraft.
That's right.
That's really good.
See, and I was trying very hard to I shouldn't just keep talking and talking. I've got to open things up, and because they're here they can talk. You all can hear me talk anytime you want. So, yeah, I have no images of ready-mades, but you can probably visualize or imagine them. And they're conceived by an artist named Marcel Duchamp, who. Ready-mades are complicated in that they can mean a couple of different things, but in part, they're often designated objects that are designated works of art by the artist, and that is how they kind of attain their status of work of art. But they're often objects that already exist in the world, like, the bottle rack is not a bicycle wheel, for example. Duchamp's bottle rack, which is a strange spiky looking thing, would have been an ordinary household object in France in 1914. So the ready-made has this particular kind of power because it's one way of dealing with this world of objects that's already out there. And sometimes artists look at this world of objects, I think, and think, what can I do? When I see all these things, and the ready-made is sort of it's a way of giving a very specific thought or a displacement to an object that's already out there in the world. Is that approaching?
Yeah.
Does that?
Yeah, and then but it's like a really important a flip of art making, because up until that point, the evidence that you're an artist comes from making art. So you look at, you're like, is this person an artist? They made art, it's in the academy, this person's an artist. But at that moment, it switches to say, this is art because it was designated by an artist.
Right.
So that's actually, it's kind of, it does something really interesting to authorship and about the status of the art object and the status of the artist, because then how do you know it's an artist? And that actually has to just be through belief. You know, it has to be like everyone's confidence in the assertion that that's reality.
Right, and it's a moment, it transfers it sort of to a moment of decision making, that the artist creates a new thought, for that the creative process is something happening up here.
Right.
Kind of foremost.
But then you have to create a shared reality, because other people have to so in some way buy into it. But I guess I just bring it up as it's like ready-made operations have been really important for me. I mean, and it was much more obvious in the beginning because I was using objects that existed in the world and I was arranging them. And so in these instances, it's really clear because it's a book that I bought and then I put it on the shelf, and it's the way that it's arranged with and framed and situated is what's making it. That's the artistic statement. On the other, I guess it's on the left. That is one of the. When I had been doing this for a while, and I started to make a space for myself to actually invent things. But in the beginning, I wasn't allowed to invent, and that was a rule. I don't know, that made things more interesting for me, or just held what I was doing, and at a certain point it stopped being an important role, and I let it go. But it's still it's submerged, but it's still part of what I'm doing. And so then later with the works at Documenta, the white object is an invented object that I made, but in some ways I'm looking at it as a given object because I want it to fit into something that already exists. So it's not a ready-made per se, but there's something that's already that's given. So I wanted to make something that, outdoor sculpture had its a particular period of salience from the 50s to the 70s, and there's this type of work that we see when we look at work outside in the arts district, like the De Souvero or like Henry Moore, right? You've got what's his name?
On the left,
Lieberman. Yeah.
Lieberman.
So if you looked at the components that are, like the genetic instructions for these white pieces that I started making in 2013, these glyphs, they're part Lieberman. Because the Lieberman glyph is always a tube. It's always a red tube based. It's red tube based.
Yeah, and you can,
every single time.
Yeah.
And my thought about it when I was contemplating looking outdoor sculpture was that, and this particular type of plaza art, was that an artist has to make something that's more, or that they did anyway, for this category of objects. They made something that was more succinct than a signature style.
Right.
It's actually a glyph. It's like an element of a alphabet. So it's like the letter A or something. And so I was thinking I would make something for this alphabet. So this is like my glyph. So part of the genetic instructions for this is Lieberman, but it's also maybe Solowit, because it has these like a type of geometry that's allowable. Or strictness to the geometry that's repeated and allowable. But yeah, so, and thinking back to the first slide too, I had been making this stuff and it was really, I was very turned on by it, and then at a certain moment I was just like, it's all so romantic, it's all so tasteful, and I kind of wanted to cut into it and just be, open up a space for more dimension. And I felt by doing that, I don't know, there'd breathe some air into it. So I tried to design something that was sort of like perversely generic and tacky and funny and slick. So because there was none of those things were in what I was doing. So it was sort of like just breaking the whole thing open.
And one of the qualities of the glyphs that I think carry over into the collage sculptures a bit is that they often have this sort of uncanny look.
Right.
They have this sort of relation to reality, almost as if they've been photoshopped into whatever landscape they happen to be in.
Right. Yeah. In pictures, it's not as evident because they're flat and everything. But when you go and see them in reality, they do have this kind of like this uncomfortable sort of collaged appearance.
But was that something you were hoping for or aiming for, or did it just sort of happen the first time you sighted one of those and you thought, oh, that looks really strange there?
No, I mean, I had an instinct that it was going to be weird. You know, like that it was going to be so, like I said, perversely generic, or like, so like have these qualities that it would kind of stand against the background really uncomfortably. But then, I felt like it did.
Yeah, I think, and there, if you happen to be in New York, there is one of these works at the Whitney, outdoors. Unless
that's true.
The last time I was there, one of the collage sculpture, one of the works we're going to be looking more at, but also one of these type of works, and it still looks kind of uncanny.
Thanks.
You're welcome. So from these to this, and there's some overlap. The work on the left, hylomorph one, was actually, I think, in process when I visited you the first time, and you'd been using both of these works that are kind of early in this process, also do include I-beams. But they also include these sort of disc polka dot circles that have an actual connection to the glyphs.
Right, yeah, so because when I was first making the white pieces, the glyphs, I was working with a fabricator. Most things I make inside my studio, and at the time, though, I didn't have the capacity to make those, so an outside fabricator was making them, and I asked them to make just some cut-off little short pieces, which I put on the shelf in my studio and just watched for about 4 years. And I was like, when are you going to do something? So eventually, then around the time I met you, then they had started to make their way into the sculptures.
Yeah, and I don't know if I don't think I have a pointer on this, but I don't want to start messing with it necessarily. But in hylomorph, the one on the left, if you see the green tube at the top of the sculpture, kind of right under it is one of these discs, these little, you call them polka dots?
Yeah, well,
or
whatever
like
they want
shorthand.
to be called. Yeah.
Shorthand.
They could be a polka dot, yeah.
Yeah, or dots or discs, and there's 3 of them stacked up along here. How did you? I mean, I think the one thing that's continued as a kind of element is these square tubes that are really kind of like duct. Are they like ducts, ductwork?
I don't think they're ducts because they're very structural, and I have not been able to have any. No one has told me the secrets of why they exist. Even I asked the suppliers, that I can't really get it now. But I have to. So these ones are mild steel, which is just like a normal steel it's a normal steel alloy. And the ones I've been using more recently are stainless steel, and stainless isn't really as structural as mild steel, and I can't figure out why you would have that. But somebody had a really good theory, which I liked, which was that you would maybe, if you had a chemical plant or something, and you wanted something less reactive, then you would use it. But, I don't know.
So,
Still looking for answers.
so what were you what were some of the things you were thinking about when you started putting these types of works together?
I mean, so I was making these tube sculptures, the glyphs, and then I thought, okay, so that glyph has these particular rules. It's always white, it's always slick, it's always, the tube is always the same dimension, and the turn is always the same dimension. You could have a half turn or a quarter turn, but they have to be at 90-degree angles as they're assembled, or, you know, had these rules. So then I thought, okay, I'm gonna make another glyph, and this one instead is gonna be kind of like a Tony Smith crossed with a John Chamberlain, because it can make a turn, but it has to be like a violently crushed turn. And so I was going to do that, and it turned out it was really hard. And along the way, so I had some experiments, and those became artworks. But so as a parallel kind of line of thinking, I had been making these installations where, or let's say, exhibitions, and the exhibition strategy was to occupy a variety of different, say, registers. So, you know, there's a bookshelf on the wall, and that's, you know, as a viewer, you approach it, you have to kind of prepare yourself in a certain type of way, and then maybe there'd be something that was a found object on the floor, that same thing as the viewer, you have to kind of come to it and deal with it on its terms. So you're having to sort of readjust your perception of the works as you come to it, instead of in, you know, a lot of, okay, so there's one type of exhibition where there's photographs on the walls, and as the viewer you come in and you say like, okay, I'm going to look at photographs on the walls now, so you set your kind of deciphering, encountering self one time, and then you kind of do it again and again. Or there's the type that is the solo show that looks like a group show, where you're kind of having to sort of re-engage in with different viewing strategies each time. So I was in more that camp in general. So, but then I sort of challenged myself, because I thought, you know, this is actually a very dominant exhibition strategy nowadays. It's kind of like what, we don't even think about it. It's what everybody's doing. So what would happen if I'm not allowed to do that? And so I just made that as kind of a challenge. And I then thought, well, what if everything has to happen in one work? And so that's when I started to make the collage sculptures. So then I'm thinking that the different elements don't really sit comfortably together, and they're kind of doing their own thing. And then maybe as a viewer, you have to sort of bring different parts of your intelligence to each component.
And each of the components is a form of steel, right?
Right. Well, I guess that's, yeah. Thank you. Softly pitching me an easy thing that I meant to say. Yeah, no, it's true. I also thought, well, before, when I was making these exhibitions with a lot of different things happening in them, I thought like, well, I was using silver and, you know, garbage and books. And then I thought, well, sure, that's easy to have a lot of different textures if you have a lot of different materials. I mean, I use found artists too, and I'm like, well, that brings even a whole other world. You know, that could be really lazy when you start bringing other artists to do some of the heavy lifting, right? Yeah. And then, but then it occurred to me it was interesting that within one material, maybe there was a lot of space. And so if the steel is, and just sorry to back up, in an exhibition where there are a lot of different types of objects that I'm supplying, I think that one thing that kind of complicates the texture of the room is that things are happening at different production levels and at different speeds. Because I've often, you know, noticed that in an exhibition where there's a lot of things going on, everything's to the same production level. And when things are to the same production level, then that's something that as a viewer, you stop thinking about. But if they're kind of happening at different levels, like something's actually like not done very well or is lazy, and then one thing is just like very assiduously, carefully done, that is like something that you have to decipher or measure as the viewer in your looking at it. So it's not just, it introduces time as a scale when you look at the production level.
Yeah, and
time and resources, and so money as a
resources.
scale, time as a scale, and size. So size isn't the only scale that can happen.
Right.
So yeah, I mean that's something for me that can be a very like it doesn't have the mannerism of psychedelia, but it can be a very psychedelic dimension in the exhibition because you're sort of like you can get kind of lost in sort of different vertigos of scale.
like zooming
in and out. It's like, oh, it's tiny, or it's like expensive, or it's like a piece of junk, and it still has the same status.
Right,
You know?
it's all on the same
It's
level.
all on the same level, so you can be like, and it can be dizzy.
Yeah.
Dizzying.
Now, and I mean, thinking about that, do you feel like the ready-made idea is still informing the work you're doing now?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. In what way?
In different ways, but I think a lot it's sometimes it's using artists as an object or as a found object, and that can be sort of that we know about an artist. I mean, John Chamberlain is somebody who comes up a lot, and I can think of that as a frame or as a maybe not even sort of like a frame, but it's almost sort of like an internal meaning that is supplied as a ready-made object. And then the colors are kind of ready-made.
Right. And actually, I'm going to hop to. We were looking at Plaza art as one resource, and I went ahead and put in this slide because they're different kind of origin stories or how did this happen, and you were talking about walking into this room of the reopened Whitney. It was kind of the New York School or abstract expressionist room, and seeing these works by de Kooning, Chamberlain, and de Souvreau. And what did you take away from that?
Yeah, I mean, it was at this exact time when I was thinking about bringing things together, and I just thought, yeah, I want to make that. I want to make
like all that, all that in one.
Not that and that and that, but like I want to make that into one thing. And I guess that's one pleasure and area of interest for me is looking at the past at a time, say the 60s or something, and there could be people's different artistic projects that might even be at odds with each other. Not that these are, but say minimalism and abstract expressionism. But then in a distance, they kind of collapse onto each other. They have more in common than they have, it different.
And they're occurring or being created at virtually the same time.
It's the same time, and it's almost like there's like when you're looking at Scandinavia and you're like, oh, Denmark and Sweden are the same. And if you're in Denmark and Sweden, it's like the opposite, right? They're like,
right.
oh, those people are the opposite from us. But from a distance, it's kind of the same.
Yeah, and just like, from a distance, abstract expressionism or
from here it's come on guys.
but I also
it's like the narcissism of minimal distance.
Like back up and have.
Yeah, you back up.
It's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
You were also talking about the ready-made nature of color or colors, and when, not if, but when you're looking through the catalog, Lisa Lefebvre has contributed a quite wonderful essay that opens with this de Kooning being illustrated.
Yeah.
But part of that is also the colors used in that work, which is especially, is it just the yellow that kind of rang a bell with you, or?
No, I mean, I think all the colors are there. Like the pink is the pink I'm using, and there's the orange I like, and I had developed this palette for the works as I was starting to make them, and then I saw that painting and I was like, that's my palette. And I didn't know what the decision making I don't know what the governing principle was.
Right.
But when I saw that, it felt very like something I could hang on to.
Yeah,
So
and I mean,
it sort of presaged it, but of course I was very familiar with that painting, so I don't,
Right.
it's chicken egg.
but it's also, chicken egg is also painting to sculpture. It's a very different thing to put a particular shade of yellow into a painting than
Yeah.
to put it into a sculpture. And I think one of the things that's kind of fascinating, or been fascinating to me about the collage sculptures, is what happens with color. Also when you encounter them in person versus photographs. Because I have to confess, I mean, even though I was looking, there's another yellow sculpture in the gallery, Cutting Corners, which is, I think it's 2 different tubes and they're each a different shade of yellow. And I'd been looking at an image of this for months, a couple of years, on one checklist off a checklist. And it wasn't until the thing was unpacked and I'm looking at the actual sculpture that I find myself saying, oh, those are completely different shades of yellow. Because I really couldn't, it was very difficult to see. And the work on the left, that kind of shift, Mazagan, is also occurring within the sculpture itself. I mean, can you talk a little bit about what color does when it in your sculptures when it gets applied there, especially in a sculpture like Mazagan?
I don't know. I mean, with that one,
it's
weird.
Kind of a big, huge question.
It is,
yeah.
I mean, because I am interested in sort of perceptual illusion, and then how a work like that, at first maybe you could see the darker yellow as it being in shadow, and then as you approach it, you realize that no shadow is there. That's actually the color. And then there's a way that it's the matte paint, the way it's applied and the way the surface is prepared. It's prepared with so much hand that the hand is finally kind of erased, and then the way that the paint is applied, there's no artifact of the paint. It's just color, and the color and the material substrate just seem like the same, so that it's like made out of color. And the matte, I think, does this thing with your eyes that you don't quite know where to focus. So it does something strange to the object. To me, it makes it seem very digital.
Yeah.
And that to me is kind of interesting, where there's anything that is happening in these could have happened in the 50s from a production standpoint. There's no high-tech element. They're made really by crushing things with a hydraulic press and using hoist. It's very industrial process. And the paint is an outdoor paint. It's a paint that could have existed for cars. But they look really digital, and I think that that's something about how it reflects back to our own engagement in looking, and so how much our own visuality is conditioned by things that we're used to looking at. And so to include a shadow that doesn't exist, that you have to sort of like recognize, or that you're maybe partially tricked by, and then to have them also look like maybe digital inventions. Each of these things points back to the experience of looking, or to the act of looking. And to me, that also is sort of like brings you into the room.
Right.
And talks about or demonstrates this kind of participation between your visceral experience of something and then your cerebral experience.
And the kind of cultural, grids or filters that we have of how often what we see is, are we really seeing what we are seeing, or are we seeing what we think we're seeing? Right. That is through all these sort of perceptual pre-existing cultural conditions.
Right, no, and it's seeing something that's working in abstract formalism, which seems like a preposterous thing to be doing. but that itself, that you feel, well, that's going to be the most direct experience of something that you could have. It's just like a form, it's an object, it's not representational, but even that has so many layers of baggage and sort of your belief system and that you're supplying to it. That to me is really interesting.
Well, and it is also, well, I've got more slides than probably time, but I'm going to go hopping through. I'm going to pause here for a moment just to think. This is the piece that's in the garden. I mean, speaking of abstract formalism and not being able to, trying to figure out what you're seeing.
Yeah.
The work that's in the garden is kind of coming out of this project that Jed mentioned for the Met, but I think the one in the garden is, I think, the first one to be freestanding. It's not painted, it's water blasted, sandblasted. Sandblasted, so it's just kind of the pure steel. But we were talking before about this disc is a polished stainless steel also, and it's really difficult to produce that, to fabricate that. And I think one of the things that's very unexpected for people is that if there may be elements of fabrication like the disc, but that you also work largely improvisationally or without a plan, and so it's I think hard sometimes for people to imagine that. And I was fortunate enough to be in the studio, I think, not too long after you hit on how this was going to work together.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about how something like this gets made? Because it's very industrial, but it's also kind of magical.
Yeah, I'm glad you have that picture. It's so nice to see in the studio, and that was really nice when you were in the studio that day. And I was like, "Wow, I got this new thing. I don't know if you want to see it." And then,
you were very excited. You were like, "You've got to see it."
Yeah, and but then it was cool too because I hadn't seen it put together, too many times, and. So, and I need help to put something like this together, and there are some people in the studio rigging the elements, and I couldn't quite remember how the disc went together with the tube part, and so, and you were really, it was cool to have a witness for that, where we're sort of like watching them come together. I'm like, that's not it, that's not it, that's not it. And there's a moment when just the composition really works, and it's like, to me, I feel like a click.
Yeah, exactly. And it was interesting for me because up to that point we'd been talking about this process, and I knew that's how you worked, and maybe the word click was even used at some point. But to see it happen is a whole other thing. And I think what really struck me is how you have these massive tubes that are, they're brought up on chains. And there was this moment when you were trying to recapture or get to that place of composition where these massive pieces of steel are just dangling a couple of inches off the ground, and they do look like this very light thing. They're just kind of floating there, and it does. I do feel like some of the really big works you've been making recently have a very light footprint.
Yeah.
As if they're sort of barely there. Do you feel like those two things have kind of gone together?
Yeah, as I've made bigger things, then I realized that I guess the whole time I've been making things, I want them to look really easy and light. And then as things get bigger, I just need bigger and bigger cranes, or more forklifts, because then things really are light, because when I get to them, and actually as they get bigger, then nobody is picking them up, once you get past 300 pounds or something, like nobody's going to try to pick it up, and so
Yeah.
then things actually do all have to be handled by machines.
And it sort of distributes the weight out, and there's a certain kind of distance that comes from that distribution of weight.
Yeah.
And so it also does create this appearance that the object is doing it itself.
Yeah.
And likewise with the disc, because this is sort of a placeholder to, what you're using in the studio. How did it? Did you have an idea, or were you surprised when you saw the final the piece come together with the actual stainless steel disc?
Yeah. Well, it's what I'm doing is so non-theoretical. It's like when you see it, it's like execution dependent.
Yeah.
And exhibition dependent, because you wouldn't make it without an occasion as well, So all these things kind of have to come together. And then even looking at the tube part and the disc part, next to each other, you still can't really tell what it's going to look like until it's really assembled.
Right.
And there is so much tension between the elements, Yeah, so it's a surprise. Yeah, we should.
I'm looking at time. Another surprise has been how fast.
Time, yeah.
I know how fast this has gone by. We're happy to take, or Carol largely happy to take take any questions. We have folks here with microphones. Let's.
Just talking about the disc, the one prior where it was like the placeholder versus the real one, and then how do you it's like that joint, there's those bolts and stuff.
Yeah.
That's almost as beautiful, as amazing.
That's what the sculpture is about.
Get from just that point to the other is, I think, pretty incredible. I don't know how do they act, the whole process of connection with these things is, I guess, incredibly complex as well.
With the bigger ones, it is. Yeah, it's true. No, and I think that in a way, it's like that's the sculptural moment, right? Where they connect with hardware.
Yeah, the point of connection.
Point of connection. But yeah, so now with the bigger works like that, then there is a digital cut file for the disc. So there is like a computer-aided part for the engineering. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to make an observation and then a two-part question. The first part's for Carol and the second is for Catherine. I was drawn closer to your work just a couple of days ago when I watched the film West Side Story. And I saw a young choreographer named Justin Peck, who is paying homage to the choreographer of an earlier generation, Jerome Robbins. Now, Peck does not stand in opposition to Robbins. He's not an adversary, he's an ally. He's saying, let me move your aesthetic forward into the 21st century. Now, how can I see that and not think about the relationship between your art and that of Donald Chamberlain? It's amazing to me that this is happening at one time and in my lifetime, because artists of my generation, man, we had to oppose somebody. We had to get down. But artists of your generation, gosh, I just see something so much healthier underway. So how do you respond to that, just in relation to Chamberlain? I know we could fill in half a dozen other names, but adversary or ally?
Yeah, I think of the power dynamic as being really non-dualistic, and that in a way I am supporting that work and pointing to it, and there's a lot of deference. On the other hand, in an appropriation, you could say, it's like there's a takeover of that work, you know, and I don't think it actually can resolve. It's really both. In a way, it's very submissive and domineering.
Okay. And Catherine, just very quickly, is there something out there that I ought to read about contemporary artists looking back to the mid-cent for inspiration?
Apart from, well, the catalog, of course, but no, because there is, I did an essay for the catalog that it's centered on the subject of scale, but it is also about, it's partly about your engagement with artists of the past in exactly that kind of way. So, yeah, we'll start there. So, how about the other side of the room?
So thank you for the outstanding presentation. So you were mentioning that you use a hydraulic press to create your works. How large is the hydraulic press, and also how do you use that hydraulic press not to fully compress it and just to squash it, but also just to create those subtle crinkles?
So thank you so much for that question. It is the first press that I got it's like this 50-ton shop press, which is commercially available, and shockingly inexpensive. And you know, it has like a throw in the middle of it, right? And so I put some tubes in the middle of the press and turned it on. To answer your question, like how do you totally not crush it? It goes really slowly. It just sort of adds a little pressure at a time. So it's like the whole process is I try to withdraw from normal time and see the whole thing happening really fast. But if you're in kind of culturally normal time, like that we experience together, it's going really slowly. So at first, I thought, okay, so I'll crush it by pressing it with this hydraulic press, and then I was very disappointed that the obvious thing happened that I didn't see was going to happen, is that you just get the negative impression of the hydraulic piston. It's not what I wanted. So then I realized that any time that I would press into it, I need to build the positive form of the corresponding negative shape. And so in the shop, I built a bunch of different dies. Some of them are angular and some of them are more rounded, and there's different radiuses to press into them. And so then there's also something that goes on the bed of the hydraulic press that can stabilize something on its corner. So then if you just make a little bit of an impression with a rounded shape onto the corner, then it kind of like gives it a massaged feeling. Thanks for your question.
Any other questions? Yeah, Kevin.
I'm just curious if the work that you're making, it sounds from your speaking about it so easy, but I know it's not, as if you're making it in real time. But do you work out in your mind or with with clay? Is there any way that you make a smaller like maquette of what you're doing, so when you actually are using the stamping process of the hydraulic press, you've got, sort of worked that out in your mind, and then you're executing it in real time as you make it?
In general, I don't make a model. Sometimes I make a plasticine model of a particular one bend, so that we can all look at how it looks from different sizes. But I prepare materials and then bend it and experiment and then bring elements together and then see if there's something that needs to happen. And then a lot of times, there'll be a tube over here and another tube over there. They come together, and then I can measure them against sort of a void, a particular void. So a lot of times it starts more with the void than with a maquette. So like, here's how big it's supposed to be. And then I can bring things, or sometimes even like build a scaffold around a void shape and then just sort of bring things together. And then we tack them together. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. How would you like to have your work received? And I don't mean by the whole art world, I mean by the viewer. What sort of response when you saw it would please you the most or satisfy?
Yeah. I think if you saw it and then at first you couldn't even see it, and then, and then you had to practice looking in order to see it, and then after a while you were able to see it. And then, then you would move around it so that you would kind of experiment on it by moving around it.
So are you looking for a psychological response or an aesthetic response?
It doesn't matter. It depends on what you have to supply to it. But I think it's, I guess my thought about, especially the different textures and the different modes of creation, so to speak, because the disc is a fabricated object. That's something that's sort of like, hey, can you make me a, right? And then the tube is something that's like very improvisationally, experimentally made. And those things coming together are really two modes of making. And I think they're kind of two modes of address. So that there's a tendency, I think, that the disc, the fabricated element, feels more cerebral, Although it has also as I said, it's like there's a way that the more cerebral and more visceral encounter are, mutually supporting, or, that they make sort of a system. And that it doesn't go from one way to the other. It's always kind of in dialogue between those poles. And so, and I think that there's, we have all these different kind of channels of intelligence that we walk around with. There's the discursive intellect has this kind of bullying position in our total intelligence, and it's always sort of, it can advocate for itself, so it's always sort of saying me first. So I do want to give it a story so that it can, go be distracted so that you can also see it with the rest of your intelligence.
I think we can take one more. I had seen a hand in the middle aisle, I thought. One more question?
Just curious, is the tube that you're working with a solid mass or is it hollow?
It's hollow. Yeah, and with this particular one, there is that illusion that it's so to make that. Sorry, I should. Yeah. They told me to look this way when I talked. But in the top tube, we cut a window and then put our press inside to press down onto the bottom tube. So there's the appearance that the top one is crushing the bottom one.
Mm-hmm. To make that top one nest into it.
Right.
So, yeah.
This thing here.
Cool. All right. I think we're going to bring our conversation to an end and shift to the book signing. So if you want to get a book, could you please go out that would be your left and my right, your left doors, and queue up there. And if you're just leaving, or already have your book, please go out this way. And thanks very much for coming out. And thank you, Carol.
Thank you.